Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. And going to be talking about fantasy today. Fantasy as part of my 500 book challenge. So if you watch my channel at all, you know about the 500 book challenge that I'm doing, where I'm reading 500 books before I buy any new ones, because I've got thousands of books to read here at the Manor. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about the fantasy books that are going to be part of this challenge, at least some of the fantasy books that are going to be part of this, part of the 500 books that I'll be reading. I already talked the other day about Malazan and the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the complete Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, which I'm going to be reading probably towards the end of next year. I'm going to start that massive series of books and just read the whole thing. So that's part of it, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the complete Malazan Book of the Fallen. But there's a lot of other fantasy books that I'm going to be reading. So let's talk about some of those. I wrote them down so I won't forget them. So yes, let's talk about the fantasy, starting with the Five Warrior Angels trilogy by Brian Lee Durfee, starting with the Forgetting Moon. So I actually have this, I have this a few different ways. I have e-books of these. I've got physical copies of these. I've even got an audio copy of the Forgetting Moon, which I tried to listen to, but I suck with audiobooks. So even though this was really good, and this is what happened. I was listening to this and I was like, man, this book is really good. I really want to read this book. So I'm going to read it instead of listen to it, because it really is that good. And I always have a better experience reading than listening. So I'm going to read these because now Brian Lee Durfee's trilogy is complete. All 3 books in the trilogy are available. And that's awesome. It's a great achievement. Way to go, Brian, for writing these fantastic books. And I really look forward to reading them. So these are probably going to be some of the fantasy that I'll be reading sooner rather than later. This is pretty high priority for me. The Five Warrior Angels trilogy. So that's that. But let's move on to another one, which I don't hear talked about that often. This is the Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison, which is a fantasy. I think it was written in 1912. Or no, 1920. It was written in 1920 or was published in 1920. Don't quote me on this because my memory is crap. So, but I think it was released in 1920. And I actually read this before when I was a teenager, and I really liked it. Although I did have some difficulty with the language. I think I was 14. And I picked this up because I thought it was going to be kind of a Lord of the Rings kind of thing. And I loved Lord of the Rings. I mean, who doesn't love Lord of the Rings? And I thought this was going to be kind of like that. It's actually quite a bit different, but still really good. But the language was a little difficult for me. It was kind of in this, if I'm remembering right, kind of in this kind of archaic style. Although not as archaic as some of the books I've read. But I also remember it being really good. So I want to read this, as an elderly person and see what I think of it. Like I said, I don't hear anybody talk about this book ever. So, I might as well read and talk about it. So that's that. Moving on to number 3, The Great Book of Amber by Roger Zelazny. So these books, this is The Great Book of Amber, which I have in this gigantic trade paperback, which I was too lazy to get. I was too lazy to actually find any of the copies of these books that are lying around different places. So I'm just putting the pictures up because, like I said, I'm lazy. So I do have this in trade paperback, and it has all 10 books of Amber in it. So it would count as 10 books on the 500 book challenge because that's how they were originally published. And I've heard mixed reviews of these, actually. What I most often hear about these is that some of them are really, really good and some of them are not so good. So I hear basically that the ones that are really good, but it's kind of a mixed bag. So who knows what I will think of all of them, but I'm going to read all of them because, you know, I've got the great book of Amber. And I like Roger Zelazny from what I've read, but I've never read any of these for some reason, so I've got to get to them. So that's that. So next, another book that I've read before when I was much younger, the Gormenghast novels of Mervyn Peake. Gormenghast. Again, this is another book that I have in trade paperback. I have the trilogy in trade paperback. And I remember these books, again, this was a series I picked up because I really liked Lord of the Rings. And I thought this was going to be something like that. And again, it was much, much different than the Lord of the Rings. Really interesting, though. I remember it having a very gothic feel. It was very weird. It was much weirder than I expected. But again, really, really interesting. I'm not sure that I had ever read anything quite like this when I read it at the time. I've read other fantasy that has bits of this in them. Like you could see the influence of this series of books in other fantasy novels. I actually saw quite a bit of this, I felt, in A Song of Ice and Fire. I only read a couple of those. You know, A Song of Ice and Fire, I'm brilliant. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to read. I read the first two and I'm like, I'm just going to read the rest of these all at once when the series is complete. You know, once all the books are written in A Song of Ice and Fire, I'll just read them all at once. It's never, ever going to happen. But, I mean, it would be nice if that happened, but I don't think it's going to. But I did see bits of this in there, as well as in some other places. Again, a book I read when I was very young, in my teenage years. I don't remember exactly when, but I remember being quite struck by it. So, yeah, another book I want to read now that I'm old. The Gormenghast novels. Moving on to Viriconium by M. John Harrison. Another book I don't hear talked about very often. I read part of this. If I'm remembering right, The Pastel City by M. John Harrison was published as a paperback, and that is part of Viriconium. I remember reading that as a mass market paperback and really liking it. But again, I was young, I was in my early 20s, there were no ebooks, and these books, for some reason, M. John Harrison's Viriconium books were hard to find at the time. So now I have it in the Fantasy Masterworks. And so now that's how I'm going to read it. So I will be able to read the whole thing. I think this is the whole thing, the Fantasy Masterworks. I don't know if he expanded beyond this, what's in this book. Because to be honest, I don't know much about this series except for the bit that I read. And I just remember it being a quality piece of work. So yeah, want to read this, and I will report to you after I read about it, since no one seems to talk about this book. This one is another book more people should talk about, Time in the Gods by Lord Dunsany. This is another book that I have in the Fantasy Masterworks series. So Lord Dunsany I have talked about before. You will find some booktubers talking about Lord Dunsany just because his work is so beautiful and was so foundational in fantasy. He influenced so many different writers as diverse as J.R.R. Tolkien and H.P. Lovecraft, two very different writers who were both heavily influenced, I believe, by Lord Dunsany. And he wrote a series of thin short story collections that are collected in this Fantasy Masterworks volume. And I've read them all over time, but I do want to give Lord Dunsany another read. I want to read him at least one more time, just because of the quality and the originality of his work. And it's just so darn beautiful. So yeah, got to read Dunsany. But I also want to read Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber. Now these are books I have read before. these are very, or at least at one time, these were very popular fantasy books. And again, they have proven to be very influential, although this is a series you don't hear too many people talking about nowadays, probably because it's a sword and sorcery series and not an epic fantasy series. But a fantastic sword and sorcery series by Fritz Leiber. You will hear this series talked about now and again, but Liam's Lyceum, for example, will talk about this series of books and has done some videos on this series of books. But it is a series of books that I want to revisit, definitely. And so here's my chance. I've got all of these on ebook actually now. So I will give all of these a reread and probably enjoy them tremendously, just like I did the first time I read them. And speaking of tremendous rereads, the Elric Saga by Michael Moorcock is finally complete, as I spoke about the other day in a video. So I've read most of this, although a new book has just been published that I've never read. But everything is now available in hardcover, and I have the entire series now in hardcover, and that's how I'll probably read it. Although I do have ebook copies of some of these, it is all available now in hardcover, and that's how I have all of them. Actually, I've got Elric in a few different ways, because I've got the Del Rey set as well, which of course does not include the new novel. So definitely going to be reading Elric once again, because he's Elric. Elric's fantastic. In fact, Moorcock wrote a lot of great fantasy. Unfortunately, a lot of it I don't have. I have some of it, but a lot of it I don't have. Even though I've read it before, I don't know where those books went over time. So I might have to wait until the 500 book challenge is done many, many years in the future before I get to a lot of his other fantasy works. So that's the Elric Saga. Now this one I've wanted to read for a long time. This is the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant by Stephen Donaldson. There were 3 trilogies of Thomas Covenant, apparently. I have the first 2 trilogies in these big paperback collections. And it's about time I read them. I know that they are controversial, that Thomas Covenant is kind of a terrible person from what I understand. That's part of it, the part of this series of books, but I also hear that it's a great series and a really amazing fantasy series. So of course I want to read it. I remember the paperbacks, the mass market paperbacks being around everywhere when I was younger. And I don't know why I never picked them up. I really don't. But I have them, and so I'm going to read them. Another series I'm probably going to read sooner rather than later, because I've just waited too long on this series, I think. Now I'm going to talk about the last one. This is a great dark fantasy series. And last year I read the short stories, but this year I'm going to be reading Gods in Darkness, the complete novels of Cain by Carl Edward Wagner. Carl Edward Wagner is a great writer, or was a great writer. He passed away, unfortunately, too young in the 90s. But he wrote some great dark fantasy, and his Cain books are sort of legendary now for just being great dark fantasy and being kind of grimdark before grimdark actually had a name. Cain is a really, really dark character. Not a good guy, more of a villain. Carl Edward Wagner got his idea for Cain as being a kind of dark gothic hero, you know, one of those dark gothic characters you'll find in the old Gothic novels, and turns him into this fantasy hero, an immortal fantasy hero, because this is that Cain. This is the biblical Cain, who is doomed to live forever. And it's a great series. But I haven't read the novels for years and years. I had a good time reading the short stories last year, or actually no, it was this year. It was in February. February Fantasy Stories. Yeah, that's when I read them. And I really enjoyed the short stories. Not all of them were great. The ones that he wrote later in the 80s were not so great if you compared them to his earlier stuff. These novels, I remember all being pretty good. I have this in a hardcover omnibus edition that has the 3 novels. So this is going to be a lot of fun, getting back to that. Kane. So I think that's everything that I put down on the list anyway. But of course, I have other fantasy that I'm going to be reading probably as part of this challenge. But these books are the priority. These are the ones I really want to get to. So these are the ones I'll probably be talking about sooner than anything else I might be picking up. Probably. Anyway, thanks for listening to me ramble on about the fantasy books I'm going to be reading for my 500 book challenge. Catch me tomorrow for Epic Comic Book Wednesday, and catch me on Thursday for something else, equally exciting. It's always terribly exciting around here at Stately Vaughan Manor. I will catch you next time.